Thank you, Jeff. Our third presenter this afternoon is Alberto Vargas. Dr. Vargas is associate faculty member at UW-Madison and has been there for 17 years. He has a PhD in environmental studies from UW-Madison and a degree in from the Technological Institute in Monterrey in Mexico. Currently, he's the associate director of the Latin, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program at UW-Madison.
Do I get to the presentation?
Oh, I'm not sure. I think you hit this. Let's see. Nathan.
Yeah. All right, well, thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers for the invitation to share these ideas with you. I cannot help but to tell you a story about how I became interested in community forestry, and that happened when I went to work to the tropics, to the Yucatan Peninsula. I was born and raised in Mexico. I started in central Mexico. I studied agriculture. And then my first job was to go to the tropics with a new research center that had been opened there. And that's when I sort of became exposed to the Three Sisters. That the Three Sisters are there in Yucatan too, in what is called the milpa maya. The corn, the beans, and the squash. And it's a system that when it's explained to you and when you actually see it, it's just beautiful. Everything, it makes sense there, because most of what I've learned studying in temperate agriculture, trying to apply it to the tropics, it just didn't work. We learned how to plow the land, and the land was full of rocks. It was rocky, you just couldn't plow. The cultivars were not appropriate. The way to control diseases and insects was also was not working in the way. So it was a very interesting. But that's a different story. What I came to share with you now is how this is related to the forestry and community forestry in Mexico. And I like to talk about this because this is an example of something that worked in Mexico. For some reason, Mexico has been heralded as a leader in community forestry, and many people don't know this. Many Mexicans have no idea that there are academic books and treatises sort of talking about the success of community forestry in Mexico. So let's start with the bad news. I mean, we all know about the problems of deforestation. It's something that it can be sort of talked endlessly, but the fact is that forest cover has been declining in different parts of the world, not only in Latin America and the Caribbean, but in Africa and Asia, and it's just a widespread problem. Looking at some of the numbers, I mean, there we are in Mexico. We're number 5 there. These are data from about 10 years ago, but the fact is that the area, about 500,000 hectares, is an estimate of how much land, forest land is sort of lost or changed, sort of degraded from primary forest to shrub or agricultural areas that are abandoned or pasture. It's hard to get accurate data. The estimates go from 300,000 hectares per year to 1 million hectares per year. This is about 500,000, that's what was estimated at that time. There are other countries there also in Latin America, Brazil and Venezuela also in this list of the 10 top sort of countries with high deforestation rates. continue with this look at what happened in the area, what this map shows, is what is called hotspots and diffuse threat areas related to forests. What you see green is sort of forest cover, and what you see there with blue or red or pink is sort of either area that are threatened by either agriculture, cropland, or pasture in a way that has been sort of changing the land use of the region. And of course, here is highlighted the Amazon, but also it extends to Central America. All right, so those are sort of the bad news. But at the same time, we see that there are many examples of certified forest sites in Latin America. And this is a map that the Forest Stewardship Council put in 2004. And there we have, in Mexico, we have there with several localities that have been certified. Yeah, I want you to pay attention to the location of these areas because that's going to become relevant more as the talk goes on. This is very difficult to read, but this was just to remind me to update the figures that were there. Those figures were from 2004. There were 31 sites in Mexico. Right now there are 46. And almost 1 million hectares certified, well, almost 800,000, that's sort of what it shows here. And the number is very large in all parts of the world of certified forest. But what does it mean, a certified forest? In other words, the question is, who says that the forest is well managed? Well, in this case, we're sort of relying to independent certifiers. In this case, we have the Forest Stewardship Council that define guidelines and certify certifiers. It was established in Mexico in 1996 in Oaxaca, although the initial talks go back to 1990. Now the secretariat is in Germany. And it's primarily a seal of good forest management. This body is very interesting because it's sort of like an association that includes members that represent very different interests, including environmental and social groups, timber trade, and the forestry professionals, indigenous peoples organizations. That was one of the questions that you had. Well, in this context of deforestation and certification, what is the role of indigenous groups or indigenous peoples everywhere? So here it is. They're represented at the table at the Forest Stewardship Council. Responsible corporations, community forestry groups, and forest product certification organizations. So it's a very broad, varied forum that different interests are sort of talked out and negotiated. And that's why it's so important, so interesting that you can come to a consensus or an agreement that this site is well managed because it follows certain principles. And the yardstick that the Forest Stewardship Council that puts in order to certify a site, they're quite stringent. They're quite hard to reach. And here is just a sketch of these principles. First of all, many of these enterprises have to comply with the laws of the country. Sometimes it's not a matter of the laws are good. It's just that they're not enforced. So any organization has to sort of fulfill or comply with the laws. They take into account tenure and use rights. The indigenous people's rights are considered. The workers' rights and community relations are also embedded in the plan that is in question. There are also multiple benefits from the forest. The environmental impacts are included. Their management plans, there's monitoring and assessment also in place. There's a maintenance also of what are called places of high conservation value. These are usually areas with the forest that for some reason, they also provide environmental or ecological services, and they're crucial. They're like watersheds that provide water for cities. So in this case, those considerations are also included in the management plan. And finally, also, in the case of plantations, there are also certain guidelines of that. So that's sort of just as a way of an introduction. Now let's move more specifically into the case of Mexico. What happens with the forestry in Mexico? So this is just a map showing the vegetation of Mexico. I just want to highlight the green here is sort of usually temperate forest in the two mountain ranges in the central volcanic axis. And then tropical forest here, sort of in purple. Sort of, yeah. And I want you to look at the next map. It's sort of a map of the indigenous communities in Mexico. Just a summary of this graph. There are about 12 million people, about 10% of the population that they define or they're considered a member of an indigenous group, spread out in about 20,000 localities that speaking more than 60 languages. And they're sort of, these localities cover about 20% of the national territory. That is, probably you can see that on the map. These are localities where more than 70% of the population is sort of considered indigenous. And about 60% of the forest cover land is also controlled by these groups. And most of them work in the primary sector. And this is contrasted with about 20% of people at the national level that work in the primary sector in agriculture. And of course, this goes without saying, thousands and thousands of years of accumulated wisdom that is so go behind it. Now, putting the two maps together, there's something here to look at. I mean, that's sort of most of the forest areas, and also where are the indigenous communities, sort of in Chihuahua, in Durango and Nayarit, in Veracruz, in Oaxaca, and Chiapas, and in the Yucatan Peninsula. And from all the sites that I showed in that map of the Forest Stewardship Council, about 46 that have been certified as good forest management, at least half are in indigenous communities. The 9 localities that have been certified in the state of Oaxaca, all of them are in indigenous communities. One of the most successful examples in Michoacán is San Juan Nuevo Parangaricutiro. It's also an indigenous community. So to go a little bit more into the specific case, this is a place that I worked, that I've been working for many years, and I go back every year as often as I can. Is in the state of Quintana Roo in the Yucatan Peninsula. This is how the forest looks like. It's very diverse, about 250 species represented there, mostly 2 high-value species, mahogany and tropical cedar, that are still there, and Manilcara sapota, the chewing gum tree. Right there's showing the slashes that are used to harvest the latex. So this is just a map of the Yucatan Peninsula. The areas in yellow are protected areas. One of them, this one, is a result of that research center that I mentioned at the beginning, that I had the fortune to work in, but that's one of the legacies of that center, the creation of a protected area in Quintana Roo. So let me just give you like a 5-minute sketch of the evolution of forest policy in Mexico, so we understand how and when and why this change was so significant and how it happened. So if we go back to the colonial period, the 300 years there in the colonial and the independence period, there was a minimal, what we can call forest culture. The Spaniards who settled in Mexico at the time of the colonial period, they brought with them interest most in mining and agriculture and plantations, but not very much in terms of forest management. This is it's relevant as the history sort of continued in Mexico. So that's sort of like an important legacy of what happened in that era. Now, there's an important point at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, because that's when we had our first forestry law. And the first forest law was a result of the push of mostly one individual who was an engineer, who was a civil engineer, Miguel Ángel de Quevedo. He was one of the, what I call the científicos, the scientists who work with Porfirio Díaz, a dictator who was in Mexico for 30 years. But he was very interested in conserving the forests. He observed the floods that came in cities that the surrounding watershed had been deforested. And so he put two and two together, and then he said, well, we need to protect the trees. And he's known as the apostle of the tree, because he really took that as a cause, and he was really zealous about that. So that's sort of an important point in Mexican forest policy, because the first forest law had an emphasis in preservation. That's don't touch the forest, don't touch the trees, just leave them alone. It was sort of what he tried to infuse in that. Now, it's very important to also consider that at that time, from 1910 to 1920, Mexico went through what is called the Mexican Revolution. There was 10 years of a very tumultuous change with participation of many different actors, and that's when the current land tenure laws were sort of enacted. And this is important because most of the land that most of the people wanted was agricultural land, was flat and that, and the rest, the residual, were the forests, and the forests were sort of given to the indigenous groups. Some of them had lived there for many, many years, but it was something that it was not very contentious. So that's sort of large areas, and that's why now about 60% of the forest land is in the hands of indigenous groups, and about 80% of the forest land is in the hands of what is called the social sector of the Mexican land tenure, ejidos and comunidades. So that's sort of what happened. Now, there was another point in the 1940s that there was another change in policy, but this time it went through industrial exploitation. That was the time they said, all right, we are sitting in a wealth here. We have all these forest resources that have not been used. So let's sort of create what they were called industrial areas, industrial units of forest exploitation. It's pretty much the concessions. That was the era of the concessions, sort of giving large areas of land to mostly industries for 30 years to sort of exploit the land. We'll see a diagram in a little while. So that's sort of what happened in the 40s. And the third forest law in 1960s, it sort of was a little bit of more of the same. But let's look at what this concession model consists of. And in a way, it made sense at that time. I said, well, it's not easy to manage forests. Let's just put together all these forested areas and create an area, and we're going to bring technical expertise through a forester that is going to sort of provide technical assistance. The forest is being concessioned for 30 years to an industry The industry pays a stumpage fee that is going to be sort of received this by the forestry ministry, and then this money is going to go back to the community through social projects, for education, health, or whatever. In theory, it sort of looked good, but it just didn't work that way. And it had a lot of embedded imbalances there, because by the end of 30 years, this system was just not working. There was just no incentive anywhere to take care of the forest. The community, I mean, here is represented as looking somewhere else, because they had no saying in how to manage the forest, or even how to access probably they didn't even know that there was a fund in their name that they could access. The foresters, with some exceptions, they were, some of them were really good, really committed, but most of them, they just didn't have an incentive to do things right, because there was a lot of money in the middle, and there was a lot of possibility for corruption, to get some, well, considerable amount of money in this system. And the industry had no incentive either, because they didn't know if the concession was going to be renewed. They just wanted to get as much as they could, as fast as they could also. So this is sort of what sort of pretty much dominated forest policy in Mexico for about 30 years. And by the middle of the 80s or late of 70s or the 80s, then there was the need to do something about it, because things just were not looking good. And so this is what was the change to a different model. That was the community management model. And this came about mostly out of the work and the impetus of one person. Well, there were many people involved, but one was crucial, was forest engineer, Leon Jorge Castaños, who was sort of, he had a different idea of how things should work, and he knew sort of the concession model, he knew well, and he knew that there was a way to do things differently. And he created a small unit with promoters that are starting to visit the communities with a different framework, a different idea. And this is just a sketch, but the system is just to involve the community. I mean, in this case, should be looking the other way, but that's the only picture that I got here. Here is probably represented here, that the community hires or train their own foresters. They participate in the decisions. The role of the Ministry of Forestry is mostly to approve a management plan of work with them. And they just sell timber to the market or to the industry. It's more straightforward. You eliminate all those steps, and the community retains most of the benefit. So this is just some quotes from people who have talked about the Mexican community forestry. Tim Sinnott was the British forester who was the first executive director of the Forest Stewardship Council, and he said that this is in the 1992 was quoted there, the most successful and in fact the only form of forest management effectively operating in Mexico. He was talking about community forestry. I mean, this is somebody who had really worked and traveled all over the world looking at forestry. That was his assessment. And just other quotes and see how this system has been so successful. So in the case of Quintana Roo, where I worked, there's the map again of the peninsula. And by the end of the concession area, there was a big concession in this part of the state, about 500,000 hectares of mahogany-rich forest that was under control of one company. And that's where a pilot project started, a pilot project to try this new modality. And it's something that now in retrospect, it looks it looks that it makes sense, but it was very difficult actually to make it happen. The pieces were in the right place when it happened, but it was a struggle too. So the squares here of different colors are the different groups of communities that gather to try this new management alternative. Okay? This tan color was sort of the original 10 groups that participated in this pilot project, and the other communities were just they were just added as time went on. Most of the blue ones are in the predominantly Mayan area of the state. This is just one summary of the 10 original communities that participated in this scheme. There was, as you remember the map, sort of a north block and a south block. This is the total area that they were managing, about 289,000 hectares, involving about 2,000 heads of family. And this is the date where that community of that ejido was formed, ranging from the 30s to the 70s. As you can see, and also if they were Mayan or migrants or mixed. So it was like a mosaic of different cases, and they became very successful. The first years of that attempt where they were really spectacular. They really achieved high degree. They were able to halt the downward train of deforestation. There was an incredible amount of energy infused into the movement. Sort of communities started having long-term management plans. These are some of the main points of the effort. So what it entailed? Well, first of all, they had to put the boundaries on the forest that the community wanted to devote to forestry for a long term. Before they didn't know. I mean, they knew that there was forest there, but it hasn't been defined, and they had to identify that area and vote in an assembly and say, yes, this is the area that we want to devote to forest management. And they had to carry inventories. And it was very, very critical, because before the forester came and the forester said, well, this is how much timber you have, and this is what it is. They had no idea how to do it. In this case, they had to update the inventories, but the difference is that they did it instead of the foresters. Well, they participated in that, and actually there was a big debate, because they said, no, they can do that. I mean, this is something that you need to be trained, but they did it, and it worked fine at that time. And they also they were required to have a management plan, and as you already talked about, the decisions had to be done through community participation, and they had their own sort of enforcement and monitoring rules in place. Okay, so this is sort of what happened in Quintana Roo and in other parts of Mexico too, in Michoacán, in Oaxaca, in Veracruz, in Chihuahua. They was happened simultaneously, and they were so successful that in 1986 they were able to modify the forestry law to make explicit the rights and the recognition of community forestry. This was sort of the peak of community forestry. In 1985, there was the World Forestry Congress in Mexico City, and most of these examples were sort of presented as a showcase. The pressure in the government was so big that they sort of changed the forestry law. Then there have been other modifications of the forestry law, but this is more in the context of the neoliberal reforms that came later. Coincidentally, the tip of the community forestry at the end of the 1980s coincided with the arrival of sort of the neoliberal sort of idea, and well, some of the successes are already there and are sort of surviving or continuing this, but most of the support that was sort of put originally has been sort of removed. So just a summary of how this change was able to occur, because you needed support at the federal level. I already mentioned that the person who started this idea, he became the highest official in Mexican forestry. He was the undersecretary of forestry. There has never been a ministry of forestry in Mexico. There was also always been sort of within the Ministry of Agriculture, of hydraulic resources or something. But in any case, the highest level was occupied for a while by this individual with this vision. So you needed the support at the federal level. You needed the support at the state level. In this case, the local governor of Quintana Roo was very favorable to this idea. There was also some intermediary organizations that helped to open the space. In this case, there was an agreement between the German government and the Mexican government to sort of open up the space so they can be occupied by the communities. The technical knowledge, the inventories, and the markets were also important. The communities were already motivated, and most importantly, we needed time and patience to let it happen. The current situation, the government support has been eroding. Right now, the percentage of the budget in the Mexican government in support of forest management is 0.01%. It's about $300 million devoted to forest management. The forest managed land has decreased from about 8 million hectares to about 6.5 million hectares. So it's a lot of the impetus has been sort of eroding. It's weak. The technical assistance is weak. There's just no resources for that. There's sort of no priority. And this is just specific for Quintana Roo, but the volumes of mahogany and cedar, they're relatively low for the needs of the community. And worse, that is very worrisome, is that some illegal logging is coming up in different areas in Mexico. It's maybe sort of a reflection of the economic hardship that is also present in the current situation. So some of the lessons, policy reforms, in this case a change in policy, and technical assistance can produce an effective intervention to create space. That's sort of one of the key messages that I think I want to present here. So communities can try a new way of managing their forest. Organizational and political support are necessary but are not sufficient to consolidate success. The importance of ecological and silvicultural science is crucial. And so we have, as a summary, we have sort of the good news of the bad news, sort of their outstanding examples, but also deforestation continues. So community forestry in Mexico can be traced back to a change in policy in the 1970s, and several of the best examples occur in indigenous communities. And the new challenges, they just require continued support. So this is all I had prepared, and thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.